how I came to do this. I met William in 1962, I think, but at the Beat Hotel. But then I had an exhibition in 1963 at the Librairie Anglaise in the autumn, and by that time I had started making what I called poem machines. And the way I collaborated, I started off actually just thinking I'm going to use newspapers and just cut up words in newspapers, but I was not going to cut up the words. The words would have been cut up by the way these cylinders, these machines, turned, basically. So they were spinning, and the ones I first made spun very fast, about 75 RPM. And so, in fact, whatever I put on them became almost just vibration. And that was what interested me, because what I wanted to do was to take the word back to the vibration of sound, what we hear through our ears, and the energy of that sound, which I felt was lost in the written word. And I had, I was about 22 then, and I had a kind of, if you like, a mépris, for poetry. For the kind of classical kind of poetry at the time, although I love poetry. But there was something about what was being written that I felt, I don't know, I was sort of impatient with it. And I wanted it to energize the word. And so that's how the poem machines came about. And as I was going to use words from newspapers, a friend of mine, Nazli Noor, who was a young English poet, British poet, half Egyptian, half French, but born in Britain, she didn't live at the Beat Hotel. God knows where she lived, actually. I sometimes wonder where she lived in any place. I mean, she was constantly on the street. Nazli, who has a very interesting history, actually, and who disappeared. And some people say that, in fact, she was the woman who owned the hotel that Tom Wolfe spoke about in The Right Stuff. The restaurant in the desert. I don't know if anybody's read that. But anyway, Nazli came up to me and said, I'd like you to make my poems move. I was using these spinning drums. And so I said, okay, but your poems are like pages and pages long, so how can I do that? And she said, oh, well, just take whatever words you like, And I said, sure, sure. She said, yeah. So I actually had to cut up her poems severely, because I could only use a certain amount of words on these cylinders that were only sort of so big, and the words were put on horizontally. And of course, when Nazli actually saw them spinning at the Librairie Anglaise, she was sort of disturbed, because you couldn't really read them, certainly not in a linear fashion. So what you read were words at random that kind of sort of came into your brain quite at random, because they would sort of flicker, and you'd see a word, and then you might not see anything, and then you might see a word again. So, and there was one in the window of the Librairie Anglaise that was a poem of hers that started, get rid of government time, true men, laser minds. That's all I can remember of it. But I remember that get rid of government time spinning around in the window of the Librairie Anglaise on the Rue de Seine, and people walking by looking at it. And at a certain point, Gaïd Projet, who was the owner of the bookshop, said to me, William wants you to come and see him. And I said, what? And she said, William Burroughs, he wants you to go and see him at the Beat Hotel. So I said, okay. And I went over, and I had met him before, but I had never really had a conversation. And I went over, and we started talking. Now, he had, actually Brion, Gysin, had an exhibition at the same time as my little exhibition, across the street in a much bigger gallery called Stadler. And he had paintings on which he had written some words from William's texts. And so there was this kind of correspondence between Nasli Noor and myself and Brion and William across the road. And I sat down, he offered me some tea, and then basically he started talking and he talked. And I hardly said a word, actually. But in the general conversation, in between many different things that were said, I understood that he actually did want me to do something with some of his text on a poem machine. But the whole thing was put in a very sort of sideways. It wasn't direct. And I wasn't going to ask any questions, actually. I was in a way, very timid, really. And I've been kind of warned off Burroughs anyway by the man that I lived with at the time. So, you know, don't go around there, you know. So, you know, and I knew that had I worked with him, there would have been a lot of trouble for me, actually, there. So I was a little careful about that. And then I forgot about it, you know. And in fact, for years I forgot about it. Now, on the other hand, I'm just going to break this up to talk about Sinclair. So Sinclair I had met because the person I was living with, who was Takis Vasilakis, who was a sculptor who was using magnetism at the time, had decided to put Sinclair into space. Now, this was before Gagarin, you know, before Gagarin. And Sinclair, who was a great poet and who also contributed to the first cut-up book, now I've forgotten the word.
Minutes to Go.
Minutes to Go, right, Minutes to Go, which I have a copy signed by him, and supposedly edited Naked Lunch as well, because he was an editor at Olympia Press and had persuaded Girodias to publish it. I became quite friendly with Sinclair, and at one point he gave me a fragment of a very beautiful poem he'd written called Homage to the Pioneers of Space. And that fragment stayed with me again for many years. And I didn't use it. I didn't use it. Recently, had a retrospective in 2005, and because there was a big catalog published for this retrospective, the writer, David Allen Meller, asked me to go through my diaries. And going through these diaries, he found this kind of note saying, Gaid wants me to go see William Burroughs. And then another note saying, William wants me to do something with his text. He wants me to use it on a poem machine. And I'd never seen that. I mean, I hadn't seen that for years. So I was quite surprised. And I started thinking, well, maybe I should do it. By that time, he was gone. And so I started looking through, rereading various books. And on reading Naked Lunch, I found these 5 words that somehow kind of resonated, and they were way out is way in. And they were the end of a very erotic passage, by the way. And they were just at the end of this erotic passage. So they may have referred to that, but I don't know. They seemed quite abstract to me as well. So I decided I'd use those. And I used them on by perforating some used oil drums, actually solvent drums, just old solvent drums, and then stacking these drums. So each drum had 2 words that they were made by drilling holes into the drums and then lighting the drums from the inside. And the interesting thing for me about doing this was that when there are 3 drums actually, one on top of the other, so it's a column. When they spin, as you'll see, words become light. And so there's this light becoming logos and light, and the interconnection between light and energy, which was what my work was about to start with. And suddenly, and in fact, my work had diverged. I had worked with light as a sculptor, and with words as a sculptor and as a writer, as a poet. But in a sense, coming together was very meaningful for me. And with Sinclair, fragment, after that I decided to use Sinclair's fragment is much more complex. In that way I've used it is by creating a piece, much smaller piece, but there are 3 cylinders, one inside the other, and each one has a fragment of the fragment, so that you can consider each cylinder a page, let's say. And the words are laser cut around the diameter of the cylinder, and each of these cylinders, they're like a Russian doll, one inside the other, and each of them revolves in a different direction and moves at a different speed. And the light is coming from inside again. So that's the way you read these poems. So in a sense, they are cut-ups, but in a different way. So I think looking at those.